Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes, and we look into theories, concepts, and discoveries that could really benefit you uh, in your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. But these are things that, as you might guess, the powers that be don't want you to know about. They don't want you to have better spiritual, mental, and physical health. And so they have confined these things to the margins and confined people like me to the margins. Um, but we're going to do what we can to at least put it out there, and hopefully uh, people will see it, share it, and put the word out and spread it around. This is a segment that we have called Bible Decode. This is Bible Decode number 458. And we've looked at all aspects of the Roman origins hypothesis. That is, that the Romans are the true authors of the New Testament. But we've also looked at other things, Dead Sea Scrolls, um, and taken a look at deism quite a bit, um, and even looked at some apologetics, um, and kind of showed how they fell flat in uh, in the face of the withering Roman origins hypothesis, which is, of course, that the Romans are the true authors of the New Testament. They wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews in the late first century, just after the war between the Romans and the Jews, which is described by Josephus in his War of the Jews, um, 7 volumes. That was from 66 to 73 AD. It took the Romans 7 years to put down the Jewish revolt. And so after that, the new dynasty of Roman emperors, the Flavians, um, which included General Vespasian and his son General Titus, the two main generals in this war, they wanted to make sure that the Jews did not, uh, you know, uh, bounce back, because the Jews had been very resilient over the last 100+ years, and they also recognized that this revolt was set off by Messianic Jews who believed that they were the Jewish Messiah predicted in the Old Testament books, that was to deliver the Jews from the occupying power, the Babylonians, or uh, the the Romans in this case. And so they decided to compose a fictional story about Jesus, a Jewish Messiah who instead was a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile and turning the other cheek, and doing all manner of things deferential to the Romans. Never once throughout the Gospels does Jesus do anything against the Jews. I mean, against the Romans. But he does a ton of things against the Jews, like overturning the tables of the money changers at the temple, and uh, berating the Jewish merchants for selling animals at the temple for the sacrifice, um, talking about minimizing all the Jewish rituals, the Sabbath, and um, circumcision and kosher food laws, and telling his Jewish followers to abandon their families to follow him, calling the Pharisees a generation of vipers. So, in other words, this Jesus was tailor made by the Romans to carry out their psychological operation. And then as you move forward in the New Testament into the Pauline epistles, you find that Paul is even more deferential of the Romans and even more critical of the Jews, almost as if it was written by the Romans themselves, which is exactly what it was. Now, there's plenty of other evidence. Check into the work of Josephus and compare it with your Gospels, and the parallels will jump off the page, and it will become clear that whoever wrote Josephus, which we know was issued by the Roman Caesars under great acclaim, that whoever wrote Josephus also wrote the New Testament at the same time, for the same reason. Now, when the Romans put together the New Testament, they did so as a limited hangout. They needed to make the New Testament look like a new religion. And of course, the Romans were masters of creating new religions. They created, in my count, at least 7 other new religions right here in the first century. And they employed all kinds of previous writings, mythologies, histories, religions, legends of all over the world to cobble together the story of Jesus, all the miracles and all the episodes in his life were cobbled together from uh, the Indian and the Chinese and the Japanese and the Persian and the Egyptian and the Greek and the Roman and the Jewish, as well as maybe the Sumerian and even the Pygmy uh, legends. Also, pagan mystery schools, astrology, numerology, shamanism, magic, all of them, alchemy, all of these things are in there. It's kind of a grab bag. But the main thing that they used to construct the story of Jesus was the uh, military campaign of General Titus, as laid out by Josephus in his War of the Jews. Every place that General Titus goes in his military campaign in Judea, Jesus also goes. And they go to these places in the same order and participate in parallel events at each location, where generally Titus experiences the event literally, and Jesus experiences the event symbolically or as a parable. And each event is exactly 40 years apart because the Romans backdated the story of Jesus by uh, 40 plus years to the late 20s, early 30s AD, whereas the war events for Titus took place between 70 and 73 AD. Also, that meant that the prophecies that Jesus made would actually come true in the pages of Josephus. And in particular, Jesus predicts the destruction of Jerusalem and says that the destruction of Jerusalem will occur during the lifetimes of some of the people that are listening to me now, and that this is a marker of the second coming of the Son of Man. And so when General Titus destroys Jerusalem in exactly the manner that Jesus describes, that means that Titus is the second coming of Jesus. So the Romans wrote Titus in as the second coming of Jesus. So this is what they call pruning and grafting. Um, and the Romans used a lot of this botanist language. They talk about this guy named Pedanius, who was the father of botany. And he was hanging around with Titus and Vespasian during their campaign. And so the root and branch idea is that uh, the Jewish lineage goes from Adam to Seth, to whatever Enosh to blah blah blah, all the way down to Noah, and then Ham and uh, Shem and Japheth, and through to Abraham and Moses and David and Solomon, and then all the way down to Jesus, and then to Titus. And so Titus is the culmination of the entire Jewish lineage, according to the scriptures. And this was actually recognized by many theologians for hundreds of years until fairly recently. Anyway, um, the main point that I'm making is that they cobbled together the story of Jesus from many previous myths. And in addition, the Romans also cobbled together the story of Satan, who doesn't exist in the Old Testament except for a few brief references to human beings. Satan is a human being, an adversary or an obstacle in the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, he acquires supernatural powers and the ability to govern hell, uh, this unending inferno of pain and suffering that you have to endure if you don't believe. And so that is a product of the Romans as well. And that is documented here by Kersey Graves in his book called Biography of Satan, which we have read and which we are about to read the appendix. So we are basically done with the book. We've just got this last section to get through here. And the appendix is called The War in Heaven. And it starts with a quote from Revelation 12:7. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels. There is scarcely an Oriental nation whose religion has been commemorated in history, but that has preserved in its traditions the story of a celestial battle or war in heaven, similar to that referred to in the above text. Titan, according to the Roman legends, rebelled against Jupiter and thereby stirred up a war in heaven. But Jupiter prevailed and cast him and his rebel host over the battlements of heaven, as Michael and his angels did the dragon, and imprisoned them under mountains where they, according to the text, says, from our sacred hill or holy mountain, with fury thrown deep in the dark Tartarian gulf, shall ever groan. And it was the belief of the superstitious classes that it was the attempt of this infernal host to rise and liberate themselves, which produced all the earthquakes and volcanoes. And the battle of the Titans against the gods of Olympus in the other world is found in mythological traditions of ancient Greece. And then we have in Egyptian traditions the story of Typhon rebelling and making war against Osheret or Osiris, who cut him to pieces. The Chinese relate a battle between the inhabitants of the clouds and the stars. The Lamb of God that taketh away the sins of the world, headed the starry host and conquered With the Persians, who seem to have the original copy or edition of the story, the scene was an astronomical one. A war broke out between the summer god and the winter god, which was simply a contest between the seasons of summer and winter, that is, between heat and cold. The winter god was hurled out of paradise and became a fallen angel. Each had a retinue of subordinate angels, as in St. John's case. And here we will call attention to a curious circumstance in the choice of names which St. John selected for the principal combatants in his account of the celestial combat. Michael is his good angel, and Dragon his bad or wicked angel. Now, let it be noted here that the last syllable of Michael is El, which is the Hebrew name for God, is a prayer to God in Eloi Lama Sabachthani, is a prayer to God in the Hebrew language. And On, the last syllable for dragon, is the Egyptian name for God. Hence, it is simply the Hebrew god El in battle array against the Egyptian god On. And of course, St. John would represent that the Hebrew god or angel god Michael conquered. On was also a name for God among the Babylonians. And it is a curious circumstance that whenever the Hebrew and the Hebrew descended Christians, hating as they did the Egyptians and Babylonians because they had conquered and enslaved their ancestors, had occasion to refer to or speak of the God of either of these nations, they would employ some odious, even devilish title as the Dragon, Typhon, Dagon, Abaddon, Apollonion, Python. Some of these were very honorable, lofty, and sacred titles or names for God among the ancient Babylonians and Egyptians. But the Jews and Christians have dragged down their gods and converted them into devils, or rather, they have stolen their sacred title for God and rendered it odious by applying it to the devil as Typhon, Dagon, the dragon, etc. While on the other hand, they deified some of their own angels and ancient worthies by attaching to their names, either at the commencement or termination, the Hebrew title for God, El, such as Gabriel, Israel, Elisha, Elijah, etc. They were thus godified or deified. In view of these facts, it is not to be wondered at that St. John should speak of Babylon as being the mother of harlots and abomination in Revelation 16:5, and rank Egypt with Sodom and On and Om being the same, and Gomorrah. And the Bible writers should use the name of both Egypt and Babylon as synonymous for everything hateful, disdainful, odious, or wicked. It was but the natural, practical, or wicked outworking of their pent up feelings of revenge. And thus the great enigma of the mystery of Babylon is solved. Reader, please reflect upon these things. And then this section is called Angels Falling and Becoming Thereby Converted into Devils and Dragons. The belief has obtained wide acceptance in the Christian world that the devil, alias the dragon, is a fallen angel. And St. John speaks of the dragon falling from his angelship and being cast into the bottomless pit, as in Revelation 21. And how did old Captain Dragon fall, let us inquire? Why, he simply fell into the hands of Christendom, who assumed the license to metamorphose him from a god to a devil. They dragged him from the throne of God in the Babylonian and Egyptian heavens, armed with horns, hoofs, and tail, and converted him into a devil, a fallen angel, dragon, and cast him into the bottomless pit in retaliation for the bondage endured at the hands of these nations in times past. And as this dragon came down from heaven, according to the mystic and apocalyptic St. John, his tail, becoming entangled among the starry worlds, tore 1/3 of them loose from their orbits and precipitated them down upon our little planet. We suggest that he must have been nearly all tail, or rather that the story is all tail. No wonder that the kingdom of heaven suffered violence. However, astronomically speaking, it is literally true, for according to Burritt's Geography of the Heavens, the astronomical dragon spreads over a large portion of the canopy, embracing at least 5 large constellations. And as to his falling, it is even so, for the dragon, now the sign for October, under the name of Scorpio, has fallen. Being once away up in the harvest month by the precession of the equinoxes, he fell lower and lower until he sunk clear below the southern horizon into the bottomless pit, or pit of darkness. The conception of fallen angels is neither new nor original to the Christian Bible. The Hindu Bible, at least 3,000 years old, gives in its 3rd chapter a somewhat detailed account of the fall of angels, while the 4th chapter describes their mode of punishment, which consisted in being hurled down from their lofty positions in paradise because they rebelled against heaven and were precipitated into Andera, the deep dark pit, there to remain until the intercessor called, also the Lamb of God, the second person in the Trinity, would plead for them and have them delivered, having first, however, to serve out their 1,000 years probation, which reminds us of St. John's dragon being bound for 1,000 years, as in Revelation 12:2. The Persian tradition of fallen angels found in their Bible, the Zendavesta, is somewhat similar, excepting that out of 30 different orders of angels, they had but one to fall, who thereby became a Paris, a devil. All right, and that is the end of Kersey Graves' 1865 book called Biography of Satan. And that should do it for today. I think that tomorrow we're going to start a new book, and it looks like, unless I change my mind arbitrarily, that we're going to get into a book called Gospel Fictions by Randall Helms, where he looks at the storytelling ability of the gospel writers and goes into depth into the kind of the differences between the different gospels and what the motivations of the specific writers were um, in, in great detail. Breaking it down to specific words that were added. As many of you know, Mark was at least deemed by historians to be the first gospel writer, and then Matthew and Luke were more or less edits of Mark, meaning that both Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark in front of them when they were writing their gospels. And then John is kind of off to the side there. And Helms does a really good job of breaking it down and showing you that these are fictional stories and showing you the sources of where they're getting their fictions from. Now, Helms is not familiar or sympathetic, I don't think, with the Roman origins hypothesis, but I think that they do dovetail. And we'll see. Maybe they don't, but we will see. and we'll break it down. So come back tomorrow for another episode of Bible Decode. Like, share, subscribe, comment, contribute, and share, because there are a lot of people who are always telling me about Satan. And so share this video with them, and maybe they'll think twice a little bit about the existence of Satan, hell, eternal damnation, and such other ludicrous belief systems. All right. Thanks for tuning in today. Have a wonderful day.